Welcome to Freethought Matters. I'm Annie Laurie Gaylor, co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Do you know how many Americans are non-religious? On today's show, we're going to learn what Americans, religious and non-religious, think about abortion, Christian nationalism, and other vital issues of the day.
The Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces Freethought Matters, is the nation's largest association of free thinkers. That's atheists, agnostics, and other non-believers. We invite you to join us in our vital work to keep our secular government free from religious influence. Become a member at ffrf.org or ask for a complimentary copy of our newspaper, Freethought Today. Freedom depends on freethinkers. Watch prior episodes of Freethought Matters on FFRF's YouTube channel.
My guest today is Robert P. Jones, president and founder of Public Religion Research Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that conducts independent research about the intersection of religion, culture, and public policy. Robert Jones is a leading scholar and commentator on religion, culture, and politics. He's author of the book White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, which won a 2021 American Book Award. So thank you so much for being a returning guest and joining me today, Robbie, if I may call you that.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
And you've written a book that's quite an indictment of white supremacy in American Christianity. Can you briefly talk about your own journey, I guess leaving the Southern Baptists and why you wrote that book?
Sure. Well, I grew up Southern Baptist in Jackson, Mississippi. Deep in the evangelical movement. And, this book really is, it's about, quarter memoir combined with what I do in my day job, which is to look at demographic change and attitudes. But it really was personal to me, and to really reckon with this legacy of the entanglement of white supremacy and American Christianity. What I found in the book is really what I had experienced growing up, and that is that this entanglement is very deep, and it goes back very far. And that we're still really wrestling with this interconnection. The history, I think, tells us one thing, but even in today's landscape and public opinion, we can still see these connections. Just to give you one example, is that even in contemporary public opinion data, when I measured attitudes toward African Americans, attitudes kind of denying systemic racism, for example, and I scored about more than a dozen questions on a scale of 0 to 10, with 10 holding the most racist attitudes, 0 holding the least racist attitudes. What I found is that if you take your average white American and you add Christian identity, that people move up the racism scale, not down. And that is that Christianity and Christian identity actually made people tend to hold more racist attitudes and not less.
Well, it was very brave of you to write that book and do that research. And how has that book been received by Christians generally? Or you said it was personal, about people that you knew.
Yeah, well, I think it helps that, I'm not an outsider kind of wagging my finger, and that it's a group, these are my people and my relatives and my friends and my family. So I think it helps that I could write, with the words I and we, in the book, and have tried to just be as honest as I can about this. And ultimately, I think it's been received fairly well. I've been, I think, at more than 100 congregations since the book came out, talking to mostly predominantly white Christian churches who really want to have this conversation. Because ultimately, right, I think they do want to disentangle themselves from this legacy and try to have an honest conversation about their own histories.
Well, that's good to hear. You've had 100 invitations at Christian
Yeah.
congregations. I understand you have a new book coming out this fall, and it's also on white supremacy.
I do. This new one is called The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future. And what I'm trying to do there is actually go back a little further and just kind of trace it all the way back. And so this book goes way back before, the founding of the country. In fact, it goes to the year 1493, which is not the year that we think about. 1492 is the year we always think about with Columbus and that story that we all learn in elementary school. But it really is 1493 when the Catholic Church, and this is before the Catholic Protestant split, so it really is the entire Western Christian Church, issues a set of documents that come to be known as the Doctrine of Discovery, that are really the fundamental moral justification for white supremacy. And it is the version of Christianity that lands on these shores well before 1776, even before 1619. But as soon as we have Spanish and French Europeans landing on these shores, this is the idea that essentially America was a new promised land for European Christians. And the fact that there were indigenous people here really didn't even figure into the picture, because the way the doctrine worked is that there were lands in which there were non-Christian people. The church had the backing, provided the moral justification, and the state provided the military power for a doctrine that said those people could be, the document actually says, reduced to perpetual slavery. Is the language in the document. This is in a church document.
Well, it sounds like an important book. Can't wait to read it. And you have also founded PRRI, which is a preeminent research institute. PRRI has shown that the religious landscape of the United States is changing dramatically. What are the basic trends?
What's notable is that, it's not just a long-term trend, but even in the last couple of decades, the American religious landscape has really changed a lot. And so, for example, I think there's been a lot of claims today about, this being a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country, like those kinds of claims in the public square. And I think one of the reasons why we're hearing them be kind of louder and more visceral is because, in fact, it is less and less true demographically speaking today. So just over the last couple of decades, we go back to the early 2000s, the country was nearly 6 in 10 white and Christian. So if you took all white Christians together, Catholic, Protestant, non-denominational, et cetera, it was nearly 6 in 10. And that number today is 42%, right? So the country today, even if you take all white Christians together, only 42% white and Christian. And the bookend to that trend has really been the rise of people who claim no religious affiliation in the country. So again, you go back to the late 1990s, or turn of the 21st century, the number of Americans who claim no religious affiliation are in the single digits. But that number in our latest data, in our Census of American Religion, is 27% of the country today claims no religious affiliation. And if you want to kind of think about where the future, of the country is going, you look at Americans under the age of 30, and that number is 38%. Who claim no religious affiliation. And we have never seen a generation in American history with that many people claiming no religious affiliation whatsoever.
And of course, that's our constituency at the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And PRRI has done this amazing interactive census, your 2020 census, that shows a map of the United States, and then it charts religious affiliation at the county level for the whole country. And we constantly consult this census at FFRF. And so you have already talked a little bit about the religiously unaffiliated, and you have found that atheists and agnostics are a minority of all religiously unaffiliated, that 27%. So who are all those nones if they aren't atheists and agnostics?
Yeah, you're right. It's a very complex group. And as the group has gotten bigger, it is, in fact, more diverse. So you're right to say that atheist agnostic, are a minority of that group. The rest of those folks are a real variety of people some of whom still have religious practices, some of whom pray, some of whom even report they go to services, but they really have abandoned the institutional religious church and the labels. I mean, so just to be clear, these are folks who say, not just that I don't go to church or I don't go to mosque but these are people who, when we ask them, what is your religion? Are you Catholic, are you Protestant, Muslim, Jewish, Sikh, whatever, that they say nothing. in particular, right? So it's not just people who have stopped going to church, but these are people who actually reject the labels altogether. So that's kind of an important group, but they are a very diverse group of folks that really come from kind of all walks of life.
So a majority of both Republicans and Democrats are Christians still today, correct? But what are the major differences there?
The big differences are the way that Republicans and Democrats look different from each other in terms of race and religion. And in America, it's worth noting that it is this kind of ethno-religious identity that has been some of the most important cultural divides in the country. So, for example, if we look at Republicans today, even though the country is, again, only 42% white and Christian, the Republican Party is about 7 in 10 white and Christian, right? So it's a very homogeneous group. The Democratic Party today is only about a quarter white and Christian, so much more diverse. And one way of kind of putting this really starkly, we have some really interesting charts up at the website. If you map the religious identity of the two political parties onto generational cohorts, what you find is that the Republican Party looks about like 80-year-old America. The Democratic Party's religious and racial composition looks about like 20-year-old America. So again, you kind of see this kind of being out of step with the Republican Party's current composition. Really looks like America did decades ago, but not what America looks like today in terms of its religious and ethnic diversity.
So could we turn to PRRI surveys on the question of abortion, this major topic today? You recently released a major 50-state study on abortion attitudes in a post-Roe world. And I was fascinated by your map that shows a majority support or near majority support for abortion rights in many of these states, including my own, Wisconsin, that have banned abortion. Have attitudes changed since the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade?
They have, and that's actually more remarkable than it sounds. One of the truisms in polling for decades has been that actually attitudes on abortion have been quite stable in the country, and where the numbers have typically been is that at the national levels, somewhere in the high 50s, 56, 57% of the country has favored for decades the legality of abortion. Those numbers have actually gone up post the Dobbs Supreme Court decision, and today we're showing those numbers to be in the high 60s, right, in the country. So they have gone up, and you're right to say that they are. It's interesting, even at looking at states where you might not think, like Wisconsin, 64% of people in Wisconsin. North Carolina, 62%, even Georgia, 57% of the residents support the legality of abortion. Even Louisiana, we think of as a heavily Catholic and southern state, 53% of that state supports the legality of abortion. So we are seeing, what has been very steady, but now in the last year have really crept up as a result of the Supreme Court decision.
Well, I hope somebody out there is listening. So just under 2/3 of Americans do say abortion should be legal in all or most cases, is what you found. And even a majority of white Catholics think abortion should be legal in all or most cases, and that's a huge change in my lifetime. So who is it who's opposed to abortion rights?
Yeah, it used to be true that people could say things like most religious Americans, oppose abortion, or most religious Americans oppose same-sex marriage. That's really no longer true in the country today. Today what we find is that most religious Americans actually support the legality of abortion. And you're right, especially to point to Catholics in the country. And it's not just, it's both white Catholics and Latino Catholics that are about 6 in 10 support the legality of abortion. So really the only groups that are on the other side, the largest group really anchoring that, are white evangelical Protestants. And in that group, it is about 7 in 10 who oppose the legality of abortion. But they largely stand in a space, really by themselves, where most religious groups have actually moved to the other side of this question.
So somehow they seem to have disproportionate power, and we seem to have minority rule going on here. I'm speaking with PRRI President and Founder Robert P. Jones. And when we come back, Robbie, I would like to talk with you about the in-depth study PRRI released titled A Christian Nation, Understanding the Threat of Christian Nationalism to American Democracy and Culture.
Hi, I'm Ron Reagan, an unabashed atheist.
When I first recorded that commercial back in 2014, being openly atheist in America was still fairly uncommon. Today, the fastest growing religious group in the country is the non-religious, especially among the young. That progress is heartening, but the religious pushback is fierce and the forces of Christian nationalism are well organized. Our progress won't continue unless we work together so that reason and our secular constitution will prevail. That's why I'm asking you to join the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest and most effective association of atheists and agnostics working to keep state and church separate, just like our founders intended. Please join the Freedom from Religion Foundation today. Ron Reagan, lifelong atheist, not afraid of burning in hell.
My name is Bill, and I'm an out-of-the-closet apatheist, meaning I don't really care what you believe, and I don't really think that you should care what I believe. I was raised in South Dakota in a strict Catholic family. I was an altar boy. I served Mass a lot of Sundays twice. The priest gave us this little card that said, "In case of accident, please call a priest." I don't really like that idea anymore, since I left the church about 40 years ago. Now, if you find me alongside the road after an accident, please call an ambulance and an EMT.
I'm speaking with Robert P. Jones, scholar, commentator, president and founder of Public Religion Research Institute. PRRI released a groundbreaking study in February called A Christian Nation, Understanding the Threat of Christian Nationalism to American Democracy and Culture. So before we talk about what you found in that study, Robbie, could you define Christian nationalism?
Yeah, well, this is one of the things that the study was setting out to do. I mean, it's a complicated set of concepts on the one hand, and it has taken various forms throughout American history. But I think at root, it really is the claim, straightforward claim that the country was designed by God and destined by God to be a Christian nation, and that people, the Christians of European descent in particular, were designed to be its rightful inhabitants and to be at the top of the social and political pyramid.
So the conclusions were very stark. The announcement of your study said, the rising influence of Christian nationalism in some segments of American politics poses a major threat to the health of our democracy. So can you tell us more about the study and why it reached that conclusion? This
was a study that PRI did in partnership with the Brookings Institution. It was a very large study. It was 6,600 interviews with Americans from all walks of life, to try to get a good portrait of just how many people agreed with these basic sentiments of Christian nationalism. So in a public opinion survey, we didn't want to just ask one question. So we asked a series of questions that we then combined into a composite measure. There were questions that asked people to agree or disagree with statements like, the U.S. government should declare America a Christian nation. Being Christian is an important part of being truly American. U.S. laws should be based on Christian values, or God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. So we asked a set of questions like this, and we combined them into one composite measure. And when we did that, we found that in the country, that about 10% of Americans essentially agreed with all of these statements. And we called this group Christian nationalism adherents, right? So people who just down the line strongly agree with everything. There was another group that agreed, but not as strongly, and we called this group Christian nationalism sympathizers, and that makes up about 19% of the population. So between these two groups, who are either adherents or sympathizers, it's about 3 in 10 Americans. And then the other two groups we had were people who disagreed with these statements, although maybe not strongly. We called that group skeptics, so Christian nationalism skeptics. And finally, a group that strongly disagreed with all these statements, Christian nationalism rejectors. So again, about 3 in 10 of the country are sympathetic to these views. And I think you can look at that a couple of ways. You can look at it as, glass half full or glass half empty. You say, on the one hand, by a margin of 2-1, Americans reject this idea, right, of Christian nationalism and this ideology of Christian nationalism. However, it is, disproportionately represented among two pretty powerful groups that have influence on one side of our politics. That is, about 2/3 of white evangelical Protestants agree, or at least sympathetic to these views, and a majority of Republicans today have basically decided they are sympathetic to this idea of the country of Christian nationalism in the country.
So the religious groups that were most supportive of white Christian nationalism are the white evangelical Protestants, born-again evangelicals?
Yeah, by far. Again, they are in a very different place than really any other group in the country. And you used the word in the previous segment, disproportionate influence. And I think that that's right. And just to hammer that home, white evangelical Protestants today make up less than 14%. They make up 13.6% of the country. That's it. Now, 20 years ago, they made up about a quarter of the country, but they are down to 13.6% of the country. Yet they are very vocal. They are very active on one side of the political divide in this country, which gives them a kind of disproportionate influence. They're about a third of the Republican Party, for example. And that's largely what's driving the Republican views on this as well. So it's that a majority of Republicans, 54% of Republicans, are either Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers.
So would it be correct to sum up that most Christian nationalists are white evangelical Republicans who lack a college degree?
It is the case that education makes a difference. It's not all people, but the things that make a difference are age. So those who are sympathetic to Christian nationalism tend to be older. They tend to be less likely to have a 4-year college degree, as you said. Interestingly enough, we found that gender makes very little difference in the study, right? So men and women equally likely to affirm these views.
Yeah, that's really surprising. So what about white supremacy and Christian nationalism?
One of the things we did in the survey is our scale for determining Christian nationalism did not mention race at all, and that was by design. We really wanted to get a commitment to kind of Christian supremacy in our scale for Christian nationalism. But then we were able to kind of correlate this with other attitudes, for example, anti-Black racist attitudes, anti-immigrant attitudes, anti-Muslim attitudes, for example, all kind of facets of white supremacy. And we did find that there is a strong positive correlation really between a variety of varieties of white supremacy. So on anti-Black racism, for example, just to give you one example here, we ask about whether discrimination against white Americans has become as big a problem as discrimination against Black Americans and other minorities. Few Americans as a whole agree with that. It's about 4 in 10, but 77% of Christian nationalism adherents agree with that statement. And we found similar views that were anti-immigrant beliefs, for example, in replacement theory. Only about 3 in 10 Americans agree that, real Americans are being replaced by immigrants, but 77% of Christian nationalism adherents believe that. So on and on. So we do see this strong connection between holding Christian nationalism views and holding either anti-Black, anti-immigrant, or anti-Muslim views.
And I found that so shocking because your study found that Christian nationalist beliefs are strongly correlated with this denial, not only a denial of white supremacy, but that the racism is against whites, and also support for QAnon. So what is going on there?
If we kind of look back to the history, and this is kind of my last book, Why Too Long, kind of delved into this, that it is a little curious and it raises your eyebrows and why is that? But once you realize that the history in this country, that white Christian churches in particular have been so wrapped up with justifying white supremacy, with being kind of really the moral justification, providing the moral framework for white supremacy. When you realize that correlation, and particularly among white evangelicals, again, this is a group I grew up in, And when you remember that, for example, the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the denomination which I grew up, its very reason for being, it was founded in 1845 explicitly to make enslaving Africans as compatible with the gospel. That was its reason for being. And so when you realize it's got that history, this correlation makes a lot more sense.
Yeah. Now, a scary finding, and hearkening back to January 6th, was that adherents of Christian nationalism are more likely to support political violence. So why do you think that is?
Well, to the why question, I think it just goes back to this idea that they really do believe they have a divine mandate, right, to have ownership of the country. And so, when you have that kind of logic working, almost any means become justified, right? If you think that God has truly given you ownership of the country over everyone else, then things like accepting a loss in a democratic process at the ballot box, start making less sense, because you really do think, no, it's the end. We're guaranteed this end, and that is us at the top of the pyramid. But when we did find it's fairly strong. When we have a question that says, because things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save the country. Do you agree or disagree with that question? Overall, very few Americans agree with that question. It's like 16%, 1/6. But it's 40% of Christian nationalism adherents agree with that statement, right? And if you look at the people who reject that idea, it's only 6%. So what that means is, that you've got Christian nationalism adherents are 8 times as likely to support political violence as those who reject that ideology.
Well, your findings are so important for our nation to know what people are thinking. So it's a gift to us. And it's been a pleasure speaking with you, Robert Jones. Thank you so much for your vital work.
Oh, thanks. It's been a pleasure to be here.
And thank you for watching Freethought Matters, because Freethought matters.
Hi, I'm Steve Pinker. In my book, Enlightenment Now, I show that the world has become a better place as reason has been overcoming superstition and tribalism. But the values of the Enlightenment are under attack. That's why I'm a proud member of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest association of free thinkers working to keep state and church separate. Please join me in supporting the Freedom from Religion Foundation to ensure that our government is driven not by religion, but by reason.